Welcome back to my channel for another Hasselblad episode, and this is a video a lot of people have asked for in the context of a couple of videos I posted on the new Hasselblad X2D. And the question they asked me in comments or in mail is, how is the new Hasselblad X2D performing if you shoot and mount on that camera body HCD or HC lenses which have been manufactured for the Hasselblad H6D, for instance with the 100C digital back. And if we have these two camera bodies here in front of me on the table, here the Hasselblad X2D, which just came to market, here the Hasselblad H6D 100C, then there are differences of course. And the sensors here have differences in terms of size. So in both cameras we have a medium format sensor, but the H6D has a sensor size of 53.4 times 40 mm, whereas the X2D has 44 times 33 mm. And that means in particular that if we shoot HC or HCD lenses on that smaller sensor here, we have to apply some crop factor and the focal length conversion in a way which is not straightforward, because I decided here to not only shoot an HCD 28 mm on the Hasselblad X2D body, I also mounted in between the shift adapter 1.5 and the converter XH 0.8, and that of course changes again all the parameters. So we'll have to do some math to get familiar with what focal length and aperture we're actually shooting here, but we'll figure that out in the course of the video. And of course I also want to show sample images here, sample images where I shifted, sample images where I didn't shift, and I think it's time to start the video. Let's get some basic comments out of the way. First of all, the adapter directly on the camera body is the XH converter 0.8 as just mentioned. There is a simplified version of that, which is this one here. It's the XH lens adapter. And clearly this is just without any glass. You can look through here, you see there's nothing going on here. And that adapter here is much more sophisticated because it's basically a speed booster, and you shoot at the very end effectively with a wider open aperture than what you natively have on the lens. I'm going to explain all of that in a moment when we will figure out what the actual focal length is we have here and the actual aperture. Then on the lens here, so this is the, I think you can see this in this way, this is the HCD 28 mm lens, and its widest open aperture is an f4 for the medium format system. And just recently I posted a video on the Fuji GFX 100S with this lens here. So this is the HC 80 mm, and the question is, why do I talk about an HC 80 mm lens in a video which is about an HCD 28 mm lens shot on an X2D camera body? Well, I wanted to take the opportunity for people who are not so familiar with the Hasselblad systems to quickly point out that the difference between HC and HCD is that D stands for digital, and this is a lens which is optimized, calculated for digital sensors like we have them in the H6D, whereas this is a universal HC lens which can also be shot on film roll camera bodies. And sometimes the HC lenses have a larger image circle, but in terms of the optical quality they are kind of the same if of course the focal length and the widest open aperture is compatible. Here we are shooting with an HCD 28 mm, and that is a lens which is optimized for these type of sensors and will of course, because it requires a larger image circle for that larger sensor here on the H6D, perform in terrific ways on the smaller sensor in the Hasselblad X2D. Another important data point for people interested in the Hasselblad systems but not familiar with it is the following. This lens here has an orange square on the left hand side of the letters HC. And I have exactly the same lens without an orange square. If you look here, they have exactly the same specification in terms of focal length, but here we have no orange square. So what does that mean? That means that this is the newer version of this lens here, and that can make a big difference. So if you're looking, for instance, in the secondary market for these type of lenses, always make sure you have the newer version with the orange square, because then with the leaf shutter inside the lens, you get a flash swing speed as fast as 1/2000 seconds, while on the one without the orange square, you're restricted to 1/800 seconds. And that of course can make a big difference, in particular in studio photography. Another advantage you get if you watch out for a lens version with the orange square is that the orange square lenses are upgradable via firmware updates, and that of course can also make a big difference. As you can see here, when we look inside the HCD 28mm lens, we have a widest open aperture of f4. But if I switch the camera on, and by the way, I can control my aperture here easily with the front control wheel. See here how I can change my aperture. It actually goes wider open to f3.2, and that's interesting, isn't it? And the reason for that is all the conversion going on with these adapters and converters in between. And that's why we need to look carefully in it, what type of focal length we are really shooting here effectively and what aperture can we achieve if we go widest open. The next remark I wanted to make is that autofocus works. So you see here, autofocus works on this camera lens combo with all the converters and adapters. But of course, autofocus in the Hasselblad system is never super quick. And here you have a lot of conversion going on and a lot of adapters sitting in between. So it's working, it's reliable. When it sits, but it is not super speedy, of course. I did actually shoot in my shooting that camera lens combo most of the time with manual focus peaking and magnification in live view. Another interesting observation which people surely want to know is that image stabilization, and here on the X2D we have in-body image stabilization by sensor shift, is not working with this camera lens combo here. And you can see this easily if you go into the menu here. Let's go here, stabilization. If I turn this on and go back, it says IBIS is not supported with this lens. That means no in-body image stabilization. So I switched it off for my shooting. I was on a tripod all the time anyway, because I was going for long exposures at night. So in this case, it didn't disturb me in any way, but it is something you need to know. If you go here and activate image stabilization, you will get that error message that this is not supported with the lens. And that's interesting because typically, let me first of all switch this off again. First of all, if you have in-body image stabilization with cameras, most of these cameras, if you shoot with third-party lenses and adapters, in-body image stabilization will still work. You typically have to quantify the focal length in the menu, and you can do this, for instance, on the Fuji GFX 100S. But if the camera is aware of the focal length you're shooting with, in-body image stabilization should actually work. Not so in this combination, although all of the parts here are originally from Hasselblad. So IBIS actually now caught my attention. So I removed the shift adapter and I removed the 0.8 converter here and used the standard plain vanilla adapter I showed at the beginning of the video, where we have no glass inside. And now it's actually working. Let's have a look here. If I go into image stabilization, I have activated it here and I shoot, autofocus works, and I no longer get that message saying that in-body image stabilization is not working. Naturally, I now wanted to know what is the disturbing element in that camera lens adapter converter combo I started with, which kills IBIS. So here is again the shift adapter aside. The plain vanilla adapter here is also no longer mounted. And what I have mounted now is the 0.8 converter with the lens. And I want to see if that is working, or if maybe that converter here is the element in between which destroys in-body image stabilization. So let's go into the menu again here and let's have a look. Image stabilization is activated. We don't get a 28mm focal length here recognized, but 22mm. As I said, I will explain all the conversion and voodoo going on in between in a moment. Let's try to take a shot. It focuses, and now we get the same error message that IBIS is not supported with that lens. So it is actually the 0.8 conversion adapter which kills the IBIS, whereas if you go for the normal adapter without any glass inside, then IBIS is preserved. All right, so far so good. So I reassembled my camera lens combo with all the conversion and converters in between and adapters, of course. And what we found now is that the XH converter 0.8 is taking away the ability to shoot with in-body image stabilization, whereas the plain vanilla adapter here has no issue with that and allows for in-body image stabilization. So I went to the Hasselblad website and looked for a firmware update for the XH converter 0.8. But as you see here, it's empty. There is no firmware. And my dear Hasselblad fellows, if you're watching this video, since this converter here is nothing else but a lens in between, it should be possible to upgrade this via firmware. You have a section for that in your firmware upgrade pages. So please give us some firmware update which enables to shoot the X2D with that adapter and fully leverage the benefit of in-body image stabilization. There are two more things to deliver in this video. Of course, I want to show sample images I shot with that camera lens adapter converter combo. And you don't shoot this handhold because you need your hands free for the shift mechanism here. And I've shown the 1.5 shift adapter before on my channel. You unlock it here and then you can shift here up and down and in this way correct the perspective, for instance, for falling lines. And that is very nice. I like that a lot. I will also show the effect in sample images. And then of course, before we go into these images, I want to quickly figure out what is the effective full frame equivalent focal length of what we are shooting here and the effective full frame equivalent widest open aperture we have on that f4 HCD 28mm lens. All right, let's look into crop factor and what focal length and aperture we are actually shooting with here. And first of all, I posted some time back a video about the 907X with the HTS 1.5 and the 0.8 converter and the HCD 28mm. So I can actually recycle some of the material I collected there, but it will nevertheless be different here. So first of all, we have three components. We have the XH converter 0.8, we have the tilt and shift adapter Hasselblad HTS 1.5, and we have the lens, which is the Hasselblad HCD 28mm f4. Let's start with the HTS 1.5. And if we look into the manual or the datasheet of this adapter, we find that we have a focal length conversion factor here of 1.5 and an aperture reduction of minus 1.3 stops. So if we look actually in the datasheet of the lens, the HCD 28mm, we find that it is not exactly 28mm, but 28.9mm. So we have actually a true focal length of, give or take, 29mm. If we turn this into action here with the conversion factor and the aperture reduction, we get here 29mm times 1.5, that's the focal length conversion factor, and end up at 43.5mm and the closest focal length, and that's what we also find in a moment in the spec sheet from Hasselblad, is 45mm. If we apply the widest open aperture f4 and reduce it by minus 1.3 stops, we end up at an aperture of f6.3. And then if we look further in the HTS 1.5 tilt and shift adapter datasheet, we find actually our lens listed here in the red box, the HCD 28mm with 6.3 and 45mm, which is what we just calculated. In order to test this out, I mounted the HCD 28mm with the HTS 1.5 shift adapter to my Hasselblad H6D. And if I looked into the live screen, I indeed saw widest open f6.3 and 43mm as the effective focal length. And you see there is no exact science here. So 43mm appears on the live view here, and in the spec sheet Hasselblad says 45mm. And if I then turn the aperture control ring here, so let's do this for a moment, then I can stop down, as you can see here. And if I want to open the aperture wider, at f6.3 really is a hard stop. So I cannot turn this any further. That's the widest open aperture if you mount the HTS 1.5 and combine it with the HCD 28mm and mount it on the Hasselblad H6D. It's interesting, if you look into Hasselblad information, you find that with H-system cameras, so my H6D, autofocus and focus confirmation are disabled when I use the HTS 1.5 on the H-system camera body. Whereas on my X2D, as you saw in the live demonstration before, autofocus and also focus assist actually works and can be used on all settings. So that's at least an interesting information I wanted to provide here. If we now turn our attention to the XH converter 0.8, we find again a focal length conversion factor of 0.79 this time and an aperture conversion factor of plus 2/3 stops. And we also learned from the datasheet that the XH 0.8 reduces lens aberrations by the same factor as the focal length reduction. So that's really, first of all, a speed booster, and second, an improvement component for your optical properties, which you have mounted here in front of the camera body. And if we look further into the datasheet, we find that the HCD 28mm then boils down to a widest open f3.2 and 23.2mm. But if we then look into the metadata, first of all, in the combination of everything I assembled here, the HTS 1.5 is completely ignored in the metadata, but not only in the metadata, it's also ignored in the live view of the camera. Because in the live view of the camera, we find an f3.2, which is the basic calculation of a widest open f4 on the HCD 28mm, times the conversion factor for the 0.8 converter we just saw, namely 0.79, and that boils exactly down to an f3.2. And the same applies on the focal length. If I look into the stabilization menu screen here, I have 28mm on the HCD lens, focal length conversion factor, and that's 0.79, and then we end up at 22mm. So the HTS 1.5 shift adapter in between is completely ignored here, although we saw before that it has a significant impact on the focal length as well as on the widest aperture. We also see again that this is not an exact science, because here in the live view we see 22mm and the HTS 1.5 shift adapter is ignored. And if we look into the data specs of the 0.8 converter, we find actually 23.2mm as I've just shown. And that's of course, at least in my opinion, a mistake, but of course you're obliged to comment on that and provide your own opinion. I think we should anyway have a discussion about all of that here. But in my opinion, if we start with the HCD 28mm widest open f4 and we combine it with the tilt shift adapter, then as we saw before, we have 45mm, or if you look into the live view of the H6D, which I showed before, you have 43mm, and widest open is then only an f6.3 based on the parameters which apply if you mount the shift adapter between the lens and what's coming thereafter. And then if we combine in addition with the 0.8 converter, we have to apply again conversion factors, so 45mm or 43mm depending on what you believe in, times 0.79, that's give or take 35mm, and then the widest open f6.3 plus 2/3 stops becomes an f5, and that's actually what we should have here and not what was before in the live screen here, f3.2 and 22mm, because that's ignoring the HTS, which sits between the 0.8 converter and the HCD 28mm lens. Now, if we combine all these three components, the lens, the shift adapter, and the 0.8 converter, I just said that we should end up at 35mm when we look at what's mounted on my X2D body now, and the widest open aperture of f5. And there's an easy way to test this out, which I did. So here you see now on the left hand side the X2D 100C with the HCD 28mm plus the 0.8 times converter plus the shift adapter, but as I said before, the shift adapter is ignored in the metadata and in the way the camera represents focal length and aperture. And on the right hand side I was just mounting on the same camera body, the X2D, my XCD 35 to 75mm lens, and I did shoot it at 35mm because that's what we figured out here, 35mm and an aperture of f5, which are also used here. And on the left hand side on the X2D 100C with the HCD 28 plus the converter plus the shift adapter, I just turned to the widest open setting, which was, as you saw before on the screenshot of the live screen, an f3.2. And if we look at these two images, they are kind of the same from a field of view perspective and also from a depth of field perspective, but there are some differences. First of all, if we ignore everything in the middle and you look in the horizontal dimension and in the vertical dimension, this is the same field of view. So in terms of focal length, 35mm, we seem to be in the right place. But if we look into the elements in the middle, there is some distortion here or differences, and that is interesting, and I personally believe, but you are really welcome to chime in into the discussion, that this is because between the camera body and between the lens we have a lot of optics going on. So first of all we have lenses in the shift adapter, and second we have lenses in the 0.8 converter, and that leads to a slightly different representation, but the field of view in terms of vertical representation, horizontal representation of what we see in the image is kind of exactly the same and equivalent to a 35mm focal length on the X2D camera body as I mounted it here with my zoom lens. Ignoring these differences in the center of the frame and focusing on depth of field, this is really the equivalent aperture. So if I open on the left hand side in my combination of lens, shift adapter and converter, widest open, which is represented in the live view as a 3.2 but should be something else, and I shoot my 35mm on the Hasselblad X2D 100C on the right hand side with an aperture of f5.0, you see this is the same depth of field. You have the same blurriness and fuzziness in the background, and it looks exactly the same also if I crop in into other areas of the image. Now, what is the full frame equivalent field of view and depth of field we have here? And that's actually quite easy because I've shown this many times on my channel. Whenever you shoot with a Hasselblad X1D or X2D or a Fuji GFX 100S, the crop factor is 0.79. So if you have a 35mm focal length on the Hasselblad X2D, it boils down to 35 times 0.79, which is a 28mm full frame equivalent field of view. And the same calculation applies on the depth of field side. If we have widest open f5 on the Hasselblad X2D or a Fuji GFX 100S, the crop factor is for both systems the same, namely 0.79. We need to multiply the f5 with 0.79 and end up at the widest open aperture of f4. And also here we can easily test this out. So on the left hand side you find again my impressive combo with HCD 28mm lens, shift adapter and 0.8 converter. And on the right hand side you see an image taken with the Canon EOS R5 and with the 15 to 35mm RF zoom lens, but shot at the 28mm, which is what we just figured out to be the full frame equivalent focal length here. And then you see, if you look into that image from a field of view perspective in terms of horizontal dimension, this is exactly covering the same area. As I said before, this is not an exact science, and we have these roundings here and there, the 45 to the 43 and what have you. But in general, it's kind of the same field of view from a horizontal dimension perspective. But again, if you look into the image itself, it's a totally different optic of what we have on the left-hand side with the adapter and the converter compared to a 28mm focal length field of view on a full frame sensor. And that is of course something we need to take into account, but the 28mm is indeed the full frame equivalent focal length or field of view for that impressive combo I'm shooting here, and that's becoming very clear if you look at these images. Rounding this up and playing a bit with numbers, we have three different sensors here on the left hand side. We have full frame, we have the smaller medium format coming with the Hasselblad X system and the Fuji GFX, and we have the larger medium format coming with the H6D and the Phase 1 IQ4. And for all of these sensors we have diagonals and can calculate a crop factor. And if we now go to the right hand side and we migrate from the H6D sensor to the X2D sensor, then we have a crop factor of 0.82. And if we go from the H6D to a full frame sensor, we have a crop factor of 0.65. And if we want to quickly backtest that, so if we move from H6D to X2D, which is 0.82, and then we apply the well-known crop factor from the X2D or GFX system to full frame of 0.79, we end again up, if we multiply that, at 0.65, which is what happens if you migrate from the very large medium format sensor to a full frame sensor. And if we want to take this a little bit further, we can now again calculate our numbers. Let's say we take the 43mm on the right hand side, which we saw on the live screen of the H6D, and we multiply it by the crop factor going from the H6D to the X2D system, which is 0.82. As just shown, we end up at the 35mm we already verified before and the widest open aperture of f5. And on the full frame equivalent side is the same. If we then multiply the 35mm with an 0.79 crop factor from the Fuji GFX or X2D system into a full frame sensor world, we end up at 28mm, which we just shot on the Canon EOS R5, and the widest open aperture of f4. And yes, I know this is a little bit formula heavy here and a lot of number crunching, but I think for me at least it's always important to understand what am I dealing with here, what is the effective focal length and depth of field or widest open aperture I create on the X2D camera body, and then also in a full frame equivalent setup, because that's what most of us are most familiar with, and I hope at least these were useful data points for you. What I want to do now is I want to introduce my shooting location, go into a live shooting, then quickly discuss images and then wrap up the video. Let's have a look into a few sample images here. And first of all, the colors come across very nicely from that evening shooting. And it was beautiful light, and Hasselblad's natural color solution just does the trick on colors. And for me that works. That's why I love this camera system so much. And if I crop in here by 100%, you find so many details. Let's start here. You see these doors here where it says Hair Hospital or Haarklinik in German. And you see so many details. It's so crisp and so sharp. Look here at this tower. Everything is super detailed, and I like a lot the way this image comes across. Here another image, nice starburst lights here, looks really good. Everything is sharp and crisp. Look at that car here. So this is a number plate from Bern, the capital city in Switzerland. Looks really nice, and again the colors come across in a very beautiful way. Here is the same image now shifted. So this image here is not shifted, and this image here is shifted. And here I want to make a quick remark, namely that you cannot use with the HCD 28mm the full shift spectrum, because normally you could shift here by at least 15mm, and with that lens, because it's an HCD, as I explained before, a digital lens, which has a slightly smaller image circle, at give or take 10mm is end of story. So you cannot leverage the full potential of the HTS 1.5, but a 10mm shift is already a lot. If you compare these two images here, it actually represents the skyscraper on the right hand side in a much better way, and I think this image looks much better than the image before. So the shift is really a plus if you have it mounted on the camera body. Here an image from a bridge in the same neighborhood. Beautiful again how the colors come across, and again a lot of detail. If you look into that, looks really good. As I said, I stopped fairly well down here, and everywhere where you look you get a lot of detail and clarity and crispness, and it's a very beautiful image, which comes here from the X2D with this impressive ensemble of lenses, adapters and converters. Here another image, and let's go a bit quicker. Here you see some lens flare coming in from the light here in the foreground, but it's also a very sharp and very crisp image. Actually, I think it doesn't look too bad. You also have light trails here from cars passing the bridge. And here is another image I wanted to show. So this is again not shifted, and this time I shifted in the other direction because I wanted to have more foreground. And I think here I also adjusted the image a little bit. And if you look into that, you have again so much clarity, such high level of sharpness, and again nice colors of the night. So I think that's it. Not more I wanted to show, and I hope this convinces you, and that's what actually many people asked me. Are these HCD lenses working well on the X2D camera body? Yes, they are. Let's wrap up the video. With this combination here, you have a highly capable tool for architectural photography. The sensor in the Hasselblad X2D with its 100 megapixel is super high in resolution and has super high dynamic range, and delivers always fantastic image quality, in particular on the colors, due to the Hasselblad natural color science, or color solutions you would probably say. You also have a speed booster here in between. For that combination here, it doesn't make a big difference, because for architecture I want to have a large depth of field, and that means I stop down anyway. And then we have a super sharp lens here, the HCD 28mm f4, and that lens is super sharp, and because it's calculated with a larger image circle for a larger sensor than what you have in the X2D, it also only uses with that cropped sensor here only the juicy part of the lens, and doesn't go to the boundaries of the lens where typically you lose a bit of sharpness. So all in, you have a fantastic tool for architectural photography, and I hope you liked that video and it answers the questions a lot of people asked me. And if you liked it, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.